The morning mist clung to the windows of Ashford Manor like whispered secrets, softening the sharp edges of the sprawling estate that dominated the hillside. Inside, Maria Reyes moved through the marble hallways with the practiced silence of someone who had learned to make herself invisible. Her cleaning cart wheels had been oiled to near silence, her footsteps muffled by soft-soled shoes, and even her breathing seemed calibrated to disturb nothing in this temple of wealth and solitude. She had worked at the manor for 3 years now, ever since her husband's death had left her alone with their infant daughter and a mountain of medical bills that threatened to crush what remained of her spirit. The job had been a lifeline thrown across dark waters, offering not just a salary, but also a small cottage on the estate grounds where she and little Sophie could live. It wasn't much, just 2 rooms and a kitchenette tucked behind the gardener's shed, but it was theirs and it was safe, and in the aftermath of loss, safety had seemed like the greatest luxury of all. The owner of Ashford Manor, Jonathan Ashford III, was rarely seen. Maria knew him mostly as a distant figure glimpsed through doorways or heard speaking tersely on phone calls that echoed through empty rooms. He was 42 years old, though the permanent furrow between his brows and the gray threading through his dark hair made him seem older. Forbes called him a genius, a tech visionary who had built an empire from algorithms and ambition. The business magazines photographed him against backdrops of steel and glass, always alone, always with that same expression of controlled intensity that never quite reached his eyes. But Maria saw what the magazines didn't. She saw the untouched meals left on silver trays outside his study. She saw the same clothes worn for days because he forgot to change them while working. She saw the family photographs in the East Wing, covered in dust because no one ever visited that part of the house anymore, faces frozen in happier times before his parents died in that car accident 15 years ago, before his fiancée left him for someone who could actually be present in a relationship, before he decided that building companies was safer than building connections with people who could leave or disappoint or die. Maria never spoke to him beyond the respectful "Good morning, Mr. Ashford," or "Will that be all, sir?" that her position required. He never spoke to her beyond curt nods or brief instructions delivered without meeting her eyes. It was an arrangement that suited them both, or so she told herself. He wanted to be left alone with his empire and his emptiness, and she needed the job too desperately to risk any complication. But Sophie, her bright-eyed 3-year-old daughter, who knew nothing of social hierarchies or the invisible walls that separated the helped from the helpers, had other ideas. The first time Sophie encountered Jonathan Ashford, Maria had been polishing the banisters in the main hallway when her daughter, who was supposed to be coloring quietly in the corner, had toddled directly up to the imposing man and tugged on his perfectly pressed trouser leg. Up. Sophie had demanded with the confident authority of someone who had never been refused anything by the few people in her small world. Maria's heart had stopped. She'd rushed forward, stammering apologies, reaching for her daughter, already mentally calculating how quickly she could pack their belongings after the inevitable dismissal. But Jonathan had simply looked down at the small hand clutching his pants, then at the round face beaming up at him with gap-toothed delight, and something had flickered across his features too quickly for Maria to identify. "She's fine," he'd said quietly, his voice rough from disuse, and then he'd walked away, leaving Maria weak-kneed with relief. But Sophie had been undeterred by his departure. "Bye-bye, Uncle," she'd called after him, waving enthusiastically at his retreating back. "Mija, that's Mr. Ashford," Maria had corrected gently, kneeling beside her daughter. "He's not your uncle. He's Mama's boss." Sophie had considered this with the seriousness of deep thought, her little brow furrowing in a way that always made Maria's heart squeeze with love and loss because she looked so much like her father in those moments. "But he looks sad," Sophie had finally pronounced. "Like he needs a hug. He can be my uncle." And from that day forward, despite Maria's gentle corrections and growing mortification, Sophie had referred to Jonathan Ashford as Uncle, greeting him with cheerful waves whenever their paths crossed, which happened more often than Maria would have expected given the size of the estate and Jonathan's previous pattern of avoiding everyone. Maria began to notice him appearing in hallways where he had no apparent business, his steps slowing when Sophie was nearby, though he never approached or spoke to the child. Once, Maria had caught him standing in the doorway of the library, watching Sophie build an elaborate tower out of wooden blocks, his expression unreadable, but his posture somehow softer than the rigid control he usually maintained. The weeks passed, and December arrived with its burden of memories and expectations. The other staff began discussing their holiday plans with the excitement of people who had somewhere to go and someone to be with. Maria said nothing because there was nothing to say. She would work through Christmas as she had the previous 2 years, grateful for the overtime pay, preparing elaborate meals that Jonathan would barely touch while she and Sophie celebrated quietly in their cottage with a small tree made from pine branches and decorations crafted from paper and glue. But this year, Sophie had questions that her growing vocabulary could finally express. She wanted to know about Santa Claus and Christmas wishes, about families gathered around tables and children opening presents while parents smiled. She absorbed every Christmas special on their tiny television with the intensity of a scholar studying sacred texts, and Maria watched her daughter's face glow with the magic of the season while her own heart broke a little more each day. Because how do you explain to a 3-year-old that Christmas is for other people? That the warmth and belonging they see on screens and in storybooks isn't meant for girls who live in cottages behind grand mansions, whose mothers clean other people's homes while dreaming of the life that slipped away when death came too early and took too much. But Sophie, with the resilient optimism of childhood, had apparently decided that if the Christmas of her imagination didn't exist in her world, she would simply create it. And her plan, Maria would soon discover, began with a letter to the sad man her daughter insisted on calling Uncle, the man who lived in a mansion full of everything except the only things that mattered. The first snow of December fell on a Thursday, transforming Ashford Manor into something from a fairy tale, all white frosted turrets and diamond-sparkling grounds. Sophie pressed her nose against the cottage window, her breath fogging the glass, as she watched the flakes drift down like pieces of torn clouds. "Mama," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of determined innocence that Maria had learned meant her daughter was about to propose something that would complicate their carefully balanced existence. "I want to make a letter." Maria looked up from the dinner she was preparing, their tiny kitchenette filled with the warm smell of the chicken soup that had been her grandmother's recipe, one of the few things she'd carried with her from the life before. "A letter to whom, Ija?" "To Uncle," Sophie said, as if this should have been obvious. "For Christmas." Maria's hands stilled on the wooden spoon. They'd had this conversation before, about how Mr. Ashford wasn't really family, about how they needed to maintain proper boundaries, about how the world worked in ways that a 3-year-old's heart hadn't yet learned to accept. But something in her daughter's eyes stopped the familiar words before they could form. Sophie had her father's eyes, deep brown and impossibly expressive, capable of containing entire worlds of feeling. Right now, those eyes held a hope so pure and uncomplicated that Maria felt something crack in her chest, some protective wall she'd built to keep grief and longing contained. "What would you want to say to him?" Maria asked softly, abandoning the soup to kneel beside her daughter. Sophie's face lit up like the sun breaking through storm clouds. She scrambled to the small table where they kept her coloring supplies, grabbing a piece of construction paper with the focused intensity that characterized all her important projects. "You have to write it, Mama. I don't know all the letters yet." So Maria found herself sitting at their humble table while Sophie dictated, and the snow continued to fall outside, each flake adding to the transformed world beyond their window. She picked up a pen, and on the red construction paper her daughter had chosen, she began to write in her careful script while Sophie's words tumbled out in the unself-conscious stream of childhood's pure expression. "Dear Uncle," Sophie began, then paused, chewing on her lower lip in concentration. "I hope you're not too sad today. Mama says everyone gets sad sometimes, and that's okay, but too much sad isn't good for your heart." Maria's hand trembled slightly as she wrote, but she kept going. "I made you a picture," Sophie continued, already reaching for her crayons. "It's our family. That's you, and that's Mama, and that's me. We're having Christmas dinner, and there's a tree, and we're all smiling because we're together." While Maria formed the letters, Sophie drew with the earnest concentration of a master artist, her tongue poking out slightly as she worked. The figures that emerged were classic childhood representations, stick people with circle heads and triangle dresses, rendered in a riot of colors that disregarded any conventional relationship to reality. The man she labeled Uncle was inexplicably purple with orange hair. Maria was pink with a green dress. Sophie had drawn herself as a bright yellow figure with arms spread wide, a smile that took up half her face. Around them, Sophie had created a world. There was a Christmas tree that resembled a green triangle with red dots for ornaments and a yellow star on top that had more points than any star should reasonably possess. There was a table laden with dishes represented by circles of various sizes. There were windows showing a night sky full of stars, each one drawn with such care that Maria could see her daughter had attempted to make them all different, unique, special. "What else should we say, Mija?" Maria asked, her voice thick with emotions she couldn't name. Sophie leaned against her mother's shoulder, surveying her artwork with satisfaction. "Tell him that Christmas is for families, and families can be anybody who loves each other. Tell him that Mama makes the best soup, and I'm learning to count to 20, and sometimes I still need help with my shoes, but I'm getting better. Tell him," she paused, her small hand reaching up to touch Maria's face with the tenderness of someone much older than 3. "Tell him that Mama works really hard, and sometimes she cries at night when she thinks I'm sleeping, and I wish she didn't have to be sad. Tell him that we have lots of love in our little house, and love gets bigger when you share it, like how one cookie is good but sharing cookies with friends makes them taste better." Maria's tears fell onto the paper, blurring the ink slightly, but she kept writing because stopping would have broken the spell of this moment, this perfect crystallization of her daughter's enormous heart. "Tell him," Sophie said, her voice dropping to a whisper as if sharing the most important secret in the world, "that he doesn't have to be alone. Tell him that we would really, really like it if he would have Christmas with us. Tell him that I make good hugs and Mama tells the best stories and we could be his family if he wants. Tell him that everybody needs somebody and we could be his somebodies." When Sophie finished dictating, she took the paper and added her name at the bottom, the letters large and wobbly and wandering across the page. SOFE. She'd missed the I and added an extra A, but Maria wouldn't have changed it for the world. "Should we take it to him?" Sophie asked, clutching the letter to her chest. Maria looked at the letter, at the drawing with its simple figures representing an impossible dream, at her daughter's face shining with hope and certainty that the world was a place where love conquered loneliness and letters could heal broken hearts. Every practical instinct told her to redirect this, to protect both Sophie and herself from the inevitable disappointment when the busy, distant billionaire either ignored the letter or responded with a kind of polite dismissal that wealthy people had perfected into an art form. But something else stirred in Maria's chest, something she'd thought had died with her husband, but now revealed itself to have merely been sleeping. It was the part of her that had once believed in possibility, that had married for love despite her parents' concerns about financial stability, that had chosen joy over security and never regretted it even when grief came to collect its price. Yes, she heard herself say. Yes, we can take it to him. They bundled up against the cold, Sophie insisting on wearing her special red dress under her coat because letters are important and you should look nice for important things. They walked through the snow, leaving small footprints and larger ones side by side, a trail leading from the cottage to the grand manor. The house was quiet when they entered through the service door. Most of the staff had left for the day, and the vast spaces felt even emptier than usual, echoing with the absence of the life and warmth such a home deserved. Maria knew Jonathan was in his study. He was almost always in his study, working on acquisitions and algorithms and the business of building an empire while his life remained unfurnished. They climbed the stairs, Sophie's hand gripping the railing, her letter clutched in her other hand. At the study door, Maria raised her hand to knock, then paused. This felt like more than just delivering a piece of paper. This felt like standing at a threshold, about to step across a line that, once crossed, would change the geography of their carefully ordered lives. "Mama?" Sophie whispered. "Is something wrong?" Maria looked down at her daughter, at the trust and hope shining in those eyes that had never yet learned that the world might refuse you, might dismiss you, might break your heart just because you dared to offer it. She thought about all the ways she'd tried to protect Sophie from disappointment, all the dreams she'd redirected and hopes she'd carefully managed. She thought about the cottage that was safe but small, the life that was stable but limited, the future she was building that had everything except possibility. And then she knocked. "Come in," came Jonathan's voice, distracted and slightly irritated at the interruption. Maria opened the door. Jonathan sat behind his massive desk, laptop open, phone in hand, surrounded by the apparatus of constant connectivity that somehow left him profoundly disconnected from anything real. He looked up, and something flickered across his face when he saw them. Surprise, certainly, but also something else, something that might have been relief if Maria had been bold enough to name it. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Mr. Ashford," Maria began, but Sophie had already pulled free from her mother's hand and was marching across the expensive carpet with the confidence of someone who had never been made to feel unwelcome anywhere. "Hi, Uncle," Sophie announced. "I made you a letter for Christmas. It has a picture and everything." She held it out to him, the construction paper already slightly crumpled from her tight grip, the crayon drawing bright against the red background. Jonathan stared at it, as if she were offering him something dangerous or fragile or possibly both. His hand reached out slowly, and when he took the letter, Maria noticed that his fingers were trembling slightly. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. "That's very kind of you. You have to read it now," Sophie informed him with the authority of someone who understood the proper protocol for important letters. "That's how letters work. You read them when someone gives them to you, so they know you care." And so, while Maria stood frozen in the doorway, uncertain whether to flee or stay, Jonathan Ashford, billionaire, tech genius, man who negotiated million-dollar deals without flinching, carefully unfolded a piece of construction paper covered in crayon drawings and a child's dictated words, and began to read. Jonathan had spent 20 years building walls. They were invisible walls, constructed from ambition and loss and the fear that caring about anything meant giving it the power to destroy you. He'd perfected the art of distance, turned disconnection into a strategy, convinced himself that the hollow ache in his chest was simply the price of success, as natural and unavoidable as the taxes he paid on his considerable fortune. But as he read the words Maria had written in her careful script, translating her daughter's innocent wisdom onto paper, those walls began to crack. "I hope you're not too sad today." Such a simple sentence. Such a devastating one. When was the last time anyone had asked about his sadness? When was the last time he'd allowed himself to even acknowledge it, to feel it as anything other than a weakness to be managed or medicated or buried under 18-hour workdays and the acquisition of companies whose names he sometimes couldn't remember? His eyes moved to the drawing, and something in his throat tightened painfully. The stick figures were ridiculous, the proportions absurd, the colors nonsensical. It was objectively terrible art by any measure. And yet his hands gripped the edges of the paper as if it were something precious, as if it were the most valuable thing anyone had ever given him. Because there he was, purple and orange-haired, smiling a red crayon smile, sitting at a table with these two people who existed at the margins of his life. In Sophie's drawing, he wasn't alone. In her vision, he belonged somewhere to someone. He was part of something that looked remarkably like the happiness he'd stopped believing in somewhere between his parents' funeral and his fiancée's departure, and the gradual realization that he'd become very good at everything except being human. Families can be anybody who loves each other. Jonathan set the letter down carefully on his desk, unable to trust his hands to remain steady. He looked at Sophie, who was watching him with an expression of earnest hopefulness, waiting for his response to her gift with the patient certainty of someone who had never been taught that the world might not care about her offerings. "This is a very nice letter," he managed, and hated how inadequate the words sounded, how they failed to capture the seismic shift happening in his chest, the way something frozen was beginning, painfully, to thaw. "Do you like the picture?" Sophie asked, coming closer to point at the various figures. "That's you. I made you purple because purple is a special color, and you're a special uncle. And that's my mama. She's the most beautiful, so she's pink. And that's me. I'm yellow because yellow is happy, and I want our family to be happy. Our family." The words hung in the air like a revelation and a question, and an invitation all at once. "Mr. Ashford," Maria said from the doorway, her voice gentle but firm. "Sophie, we should let him get back to work. Say good night." But Jonathan found himself speaking before he'd consciously decided to form words. "Wait." They both turned to look at him, and he felt suddenly exposed, uncertain, fumbling in territory he'd spent decades avoiding. "The letter says you invited me to have Christmas with you." Sophie nodded enthusiastically. "In our cottage. Mama makes really good soup and we have a tree. Well, it's branches, but it's still a tree, and I have a book about Christmas that Mama reads to me every night, and you could hear it too if you want it." Jonathan looked at Maria, whose expression had shifted into something complicated. Surprise and wariness, and a carefully controlled hopefulness that she was clearly trying not to feel. He recognized that look. He'd spent years perfecting it himself, that armor of low expectations designed to protect against disappointment. "You don't have to," Maria said quickly. "Sophie doesn't understand. She just thought." "I'd like to," Jonathan interrupted, and the words felt strange in his mouth. This acceptance of something offered freely, this admission of one instead of need or strategy or calculated benefit. "If the invitation is genuine, I'd very much like to have Christmas with you." The smile that broke across Sophie's face was so purely joyful that Jonathan felt something in his chest crack open wider, some long-sealed chamber flooding with light. "Really? Really, really? Really, really," he confirmed, and found himself almost smiling, the expression feeling foreign and natural all at once. After they left, Jonathan sat alone in his study, the letter still on his desk, and did something he hadn't done in longer than he could remember. He cried. Not the careful, controlled tears he'd allowed himself at his parents' funeral, not the angry tears he'd shed in privacy after his fiancée left, but deep, wrenching sobs that shook his shoulders and left him gasping, purging years of accumulated loneliness and self-imposed isolation. When the storm passed, He felt hollowed out and somehow lighter, as if he'd been carrying a weight he'd stopped noticing until it was finally set down. He picked up the letter again, studied Sophie's drawing more carefully. She'd drawn a window showing stars, and he realized with a jolt that he couldn't remember the last time he'd actually looked at the night sky, really looked at it, instead of merely passing beneath it on his way from one obligation to another. The next 2 weeks passed in a strange state of heightened awareness. Jonathan found himself noticing things he'd previously moved through like background noise. He noticed how Maria hummed softly while she worked, different songs on different days, always something gentle and slightly melancholic. He noticed how Sophie approached the world with a scientist's curiosity and a poet's wonder, stopping to examine dust motes and sunbeams, or conducting elaborate conversations with the stone lions that flanked the manor's entrance. He noticed the way Maria's face softened when she looked at her daughter, a love so evident and uncomplicated that it made his own life feel impoverished by comparison. He noticed the worn patches on Sophie's coat, the way Maria's shoes were practical and inexpensive, the evidence of a life carefully managed with limited resources and unlimited determination. And he noticed, with growing discomfort, the vast emptiness of his own existence. The mansion had 32 rooms, and he used perhaps 5 of them. He owned more than he could possibly need and lacked everything that mattered. He was surrounded by luxury and starving for connection, wealthy beyond measure and poor in all the ways that actually counted. One evening, about a week before Christmas, he found himself in the East Wing, standing before the covered photographs he'd avoided for years. He pulled the sheets away one by one, revealing his family frozen in moments of joy he'd spent 15 years trying not to remember because remembering hurt too much. His mother, laughing at something his father said. His father, beaming with pride at Jonathan's college graduation. The 3 of them together on a boat, faces sunbright and happy, before the car accident that had ended everything. But looking at them now, through the lens of Sophie's letter and the question it had posed about what family meant and how it might be found, Jonathan realized something that shifted his understanding of the past 15 years. He hadn't been honoring them by sealing himself off from life. He'd been betraying everything they'd valued, everything they'd hoped for him. His mother had been like Sophie. She believed in the power of love to transform ordinary moments into magic. His father had been a man of deep feeling beneath his businesslike exterior. They'd wanted him to be successful, yes, but they'd wanted him to be happy more. They wouldn't have wanted this. This magnificent prison he'd built, this empty monument to isolation and achievement. They would have wanted him to risk again, to try again, to remember that being hurt meant you'd been brave enough to care about something beyond yourself. Jonathan made a decision then, standing in that dusty wing filled with the ghosts of his former life. He would accept Sophie's invitation not as a charitable gesture toward his employees, not as a momentary deviation from his carefully controlled routine, but as the first step toward something different. Toward the possibility that at 42, having spent 2 decades building walls, he might still learn how to build bridges instead. He returned to his study and did something he'd never done before.
He closed his laptop.
He silenced his phone. He sat in the silence of the great house and imagined it filled with the sounds of life, laughter and conversation, and the small domestic symphonies of people sharing space and time, and the ordinary magic of being together. And in his mind's eye, he saw a stick figure drawn in purple crayon, sitting at a table, smiling because he was no longer alone. It was a child's fantasy, impossible and naive and utterly disconnected from the practical realities of his complicated life. But for the first time in longer than he could remember, Jonathan Ashford allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, a child's wisdom might be worth more than an adult's carefully constructed defenses. The letter remained on his desk, pinned down by a paperweight that had belonged to his father. Every day he glanced at it, at Sophie's crooked letters spelling out her name, at the crayon family that existed nowhere but in a 3-year-old's generous heart. And every day, the hope grew a little stronger, the walls cracked a little wider, and the man who had convinced himself he preferred solitude began to admit how profoundly he longed for something else. The cottage had never felt smaller or more precious than it did on Christmas Eve as Maria attempted to transform their humble space into something magical. She'd spent her day off gathering pine boughs from the estate's woods, their sharp scent filling the small rooms with the promise of celebration. Sophie helped by testing every ornament to determine if it was shiny enough for their important guest, her standards apparently quite high despite their limited materials. "Mama, do you think Uncle likes soup?" Sophie asked for perhaps the 15th time that day, her little face creased with the serious concern of a host determined to get every detail right. "Everyone likes soup, Mija," Maria assured her, stirring the pot that simmered on their tiny stove. She'd made her grandmother's special Christmas posel, the recipe that required hours of preparation and ingredients she'd saved for weeks to afford. The pork was tender, the hominy perfectly cooked, the broth rich with chiles and garlic, and the kind of love that turned simple food into communion. But beneath her outward calm, Maria's hands trembled slightly as she worked. What had she been thinking, allowing this? Inviting her employer, a billionaire, into their shabby cottage to sit at a table that wobbled despite the folded napkin under one leg, to eat from mismatched bowls she'd collected from thrift stores, to pretend even for one evening that the vast gulf between their lives didn't exist? He would see how they lived, really lived, and what would he think? That she was pitiful? That Sophie was growing up in conditions beneath what any child deserved? That Maria herself was failing at the most fundamental task of motherhood, which was providing a proper home? "Mama?" Sophie's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "You're doing the worry face." Maria looked down at her daughter, so small and so certain, untouched yet by the doubts and fears that accumulated with adulthood like dust in unused rooms. "I'm not worried, baby. Just thinking." "About Uncle coming?" "Yes." Sophie wrapped her arms around Maria's legs, pressing her face against her mother's hip in the unself-conscious affection of childhood. "Don't be scared, Mama. He's nice. I can tell because he has sad eyes like you do sometimes, and people with sad eyes are usually very nice because they know what sad feels like." The simple wisdom of it made Maria's throat tighten. When had her 3-year-old become so wise? Or had Maria herself become so defended, so focused on survival and propriety and maintaining appropriate boundaries, that she'd forgotten how to see people clearly? A knock at the door came at exactly 6 o'clock, because of course Jonathan Ashford would be precisely punctual. Maria wiped her hands on her apron, checked her reflection in the small mirror by the door, seeing a tired woman in her best dress, which wasn't much, her hair pulled back in a simple bun, her face bare of makeup because she'd never been able to afford the kind that might improve anything, and opened the door. Jonathan stood on her doorstep, looking more uncertain than she'd ever seen him. He wore jeans and a sweater instead of his usual immaculate suit, and he was holding 2 wrapped packages and an expression of such vulnerable nervousness that Maria forgot to feel self-conscious about her cottage, or her cooking, or the entire impossible situation. "I hope I'm not too early," he said. "Or inappropriately dressed." I wasn't sure what. He stopped himself, a man who commanded boardrooms rendered inarticulate by a dinner invitation from a child. "I brought gifts." Was that wrong? "Uncle." Sophie saved them both by launching herself at Jonathan's legs with the enthusiasm of someone greeting a beloved relative after a long absence. "You came? You really came?" "I told Mama you would, but she did the worry face, and I said people with sad eyes are usually nice, And look, you're here. Jonathan awkwardly managed to return Sophie's hug while not dropping the packages, looking down at the child attached to his legs with an expression that cycled through surprise, discomfort, and then something softer that made Maria's heart do a complicated thing in her chest. "Please come in," Maria said, stepping back to let him enter their small world. If Jonathan was shocked by the modesty of their accommodations, he had the grace not to show it. His eyes took in the carefully decorated pine branches, the paper snowflakes Sophie had cut with her child's scissors and taped to every available surface, the table set with their mismatched dishes, and the candles Maria had found at the dollar store. But instead of the pity or discomfort Maria had feared seeing on his face, there was something else. Wonder, perhaps. Or maybe hunger, the kind that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with meaning. "Your home is lovely," he said quietly, and Maria heard the truth in his voice, the recognition of something his mansion lacked despite its marble and its chandeliers, and its rooms designed by people paid to create beauty without soul. "It's small," Maria said before she could stop herself, the apology automatic. "It's warm," Jonathan corrected, and the way he said it made Maria realize he wasn't talking about temperature. The dinner was simple by the standards of the meals Maria prepared in the Manor's grand dining room. No multiple courses, no wine pairings, no elegant presentations on china that cost more than her monthly salary. Just bowls of pozole served with warm tortillas and lime wedges, Christmas music playing softly from Sophie's toy radio, and a conversation that started awkwardly but gradually found its rhythm. Sophie, of course, had no patience for adult reserve. She chattered constantly, telling Jonathan about her favorite cartoon characters and the birds she fed in the garden, and her plan to be a veterinarian princess when she grew up, which she explained was someone who takes care of sick animals but also wears a crown because crowns are important for making people feel special. Jonathan listened with an attention that seemed almost painful in its intensity, as if he were trying to memorize every word, to understand some crucial lesson encoded in the simple observations of a 3-year-old. He asked questions, real questions, not the patronizing sort adults often pose to children, and seemed genuinely interested in Sophie's detailed explanations of which crayon colors were best for drawing different emotions. "Red is for happy angry," Sophie explained seriously, "which is like when you're happy but also you really, really want something. Blue is for quiet sad, which is different from loud sad, which is purple. Yellow is always just happy because yellow is too bright to be sad about anything." "What color am I?" Jonathan asked, and Maria heard something beneath the question, some genuine need to know how this child saw him. Sophie studied him with the seriousness of an art critic before a masterpiece, her head tilted, her eyes narrowed in concentration. "You're blue trying to be yellow," she finally pronounced. "But that's okay, because Mama says trying is the bravest thing, and brave is a very good thing to be." Jonathan's eyes met Maria's across the table, and she saw moisture gathering there, tears he was fighting not to shed in front of the child who'd somehow seen through him with the casual clarity that children possessed before the world taught them to look away from uncomfortable truths. "Your daughter is remarkable," he said softly. "I know," Maria replied, because it was the truest thing she'd ever said. After dinner, they moved to the small couch, Sophie positioning herself between the two adults with a satisfied air of someone whose careful plans were coming to fruition. Jonathan distributed the gifts he brought, a large one for Sophie, a smaller one for Maria. Sophie tore into her package with a gleeful abandon of childhood, revealing an enormous set of art supplies, every conceivable color of crayon and marker, quality paper in various sizes, stickers and stamps and glitter glue, and everything a young artist could desire. "For your drawings," Jonathan explained as Sophie stared at the treasure trove with wide eyes. "I thought since you made me such a special picture, you might like more materials for making art." "It's so much," Sophie whispered, and then she did something that made both adults freeze. She carefully set down the art supplies, climbed into Jonathan's lap, wrapped her arms around his neck, and held on tight. "Thank you, Uncle. This is the best present ever, and also you give really good hugs. Did you know that? You should practice hugging more because you're better at it than you think." Over Sophie's head, Jonathan's eyes met Maria's, and she saw him struggling with emotions too large and complex for words. His arms came up slowly to return the child's embrace, tentative at first and then tighter, as if he were holding onto something precious that might disappear if he didn't grip it firmly enough. When Sophie finally released him to explore her new art supplies, Jonathan turned to Maria and handed her the smaller package with hands that weren't quite steady. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper, Maria found a photograph in an elegant frame. It took her a moment to recognize it, her and Sophie, captured by one of the manor's many security cameras, in the garden on a sunny day. Sophie was laughing, reaching up toward a butterfly, and Maria was looking down at her daughter with an expression of such pure love that it made her throat tighten to see it reflected back at her. "I hope this isn't overstepping," Jonathan said quickly. "I just thought you should have a picture of the two of you." The camera caught this moment, and it seemed too beautiful not to preserve. "It's perfect," Maria managed, because it was. In all her careful budgeting and planning, she'd never had money for a decent camera, had never thought to ask anyone to photograph the small, precious moments that made up their lives. And now here was this impossible gift, this evidence that someone had been watching, had noticed, had thought they were worth preserving. "I have something for you too," Maria said, retrieving the small package she'd hidden behind the couch. She'd agonized over what to give a man who could buy anything, finally settling on something simple, because it was all she had to offer. Inside the wrapping was a scarf she'd knitted herself, deep blue wool worked in a simple pattern during the late-night hours when Sophie slept and Maria's hands needed something to do besides worry. Jonathan held it as if it were made of gold, his fingers tracing the slightly uneven stitches, the evidence of handmade imperfection and care. "You made this." "It's not much," Maria started, but Jonathan shook his head. "It's everything," he said quietly. "No one has made me anything since." He stopped, unable or unwilling to finish the sentence, but Maria understood. Since his mother died. Since he'd become the kind of person people worked for instead of the kind of person people made things for. Sophie, surrounded by her art supplies, began to yawn despite her best efforts to stay awake for every moment of this special evening. Maria moved to carry her to bed, but Sophie insisted on hugging Jonathan goodnight first. "Will you come back?" Sophie asked sleepily, her head already dropping toward her mother's shoulder. "Not just for Christmas. For regular days too." "If your mother says it's all right," Jonathan said, looking at Maria with a question in his eyes that went deeper than the words suggested. Maria thought about all the reasons to say no, all the complications this would introduce into their carefully maintained employer-employee relationship. She thought about the risks of blurring boundaries, of letting Sophie get attached to someone who existed in a different world, of allowing herself to hope for connections that couldn't possibly last. And then she thought about the man sitting in her humble cottage, wearing a hand-knitted scarf and holding her daughter's letter like it was holy scripture, the loneliest rich man she'd ever met, the saddest person in the biggest house. She thought about Sophie's wisdom about families being people who loved each other, and about how love, real love, was always a risk but also always worth it.
"Yes," she said.
"You can come back." The smile that broke across Jonathan's face was like watching the sun rise. Christmas morning arrived wrapped in snow and silence, the kind of perfect winter stillness that made the world feel newly created. Jonathan woke in his usual bedroom, in his usual bed, in the same mansion where he'd spent so many identical mornings. But everything felt different, as if the axis of his world had shifted slightly, tilting him towards something he didn't yet have words for but recognized in his bones as essential. He'd barely slept, his mind replaying the evening in the cottage like a film he needed to memorize before it faded. The puzzle that had tasted like home despite his inability to remember what home tasted like. Sophie's unself-conscious affection, the way she'd climbed into his lap as if she belonged there, as if he were someone worth trusting with the weight of a child's faith. Maria's smile when she'd said yes, "You can come back," a smile that contained entire universes of possibility and risk. The scarf she'd made him lay on his nightstand, and he reached for it now, wrapping it around his neck despite being inside, despite it being a gesture that made no practical sense. It smelled faintly of her cottage, something like vanilla and pine, and that indefinable scent of a home that was actually lived in rather than simply occupied. His phone buzzed with the usual Christmas morning messages from business associates and distant relatives, pro forma greetings that meant nothing from people who knew nothing about him beyond his net worth and his reputation. He ignored them all and instead found himself opening the email he drafted at 3 in the morning, unable to sleep, unable to stop thinking about what came next. The email was to his assistant, outlining changes to his schedule that would have been unthinkable just days ago. Reduced hours. No more weekend work unless absolutely essential. A block of time every evening marked simply as personal in his calendar. And then the more concrete instructions. Increase Maria's salary substantially. Establish a college fund for Sophie. Look into the best preschools in the area and arrange for Sophie's enrollment and all associated costs. He read it over one more time, his finger hovering over the send button. This was the kind of gesture that could be misinterpreted, that could seem like he was trying to buy his way into their lives, that could make everything awkward and transactional. But it wasn't about buying anything. It was about finally, using his resources for something that mattered, for people who mattered, for the first family he'd allowed himself to care about since the accident took his own. He pressed send before he could overthink it further. Then he dressed simply, in the jeans and sweater that had felt so right last night, wrapped Maria's scarf around his neck, and headed toward the cottage with a nervousness that rivaled his first major business presentation. Maria answered his knock in her bathrobe, her hair loose around her shoulders, Sophie visible behind her in pajamas covered in cartoon reindeer, both of them clearly surprised by his early arrival. "I'm sorry," Jonathan said quickly. "I should have called first. I just thought I wanted—" He stopped, realizing he'd been so focused on getting here that he hadn't actually planned what to say. "I brought coffee. And pastries. From that bakery in town that supposedly has the best croissants in the state. I wasn't sure if you celebrated Christmas morning in a particular way, but I thought." "Jonathan," Maria said gently, using his first name for the first time, and the sound of it in her voice made something in his chest expand painfully. "Come in. You're always welcome here." The morning unfolded with the easy chaos of Christmas, with a child. Sophie opened the few presents Maria had managed to save for, each one received with such genuine delight that Jonathan felt ashamed of his own childhood Christmases, where piles of expensive gifts had been accumulated and discarded with barely a thought. Sophie cherished every small thing: a new book, a stuffed elephant, a puzzle with pieces almost as large as her hands. Then she retrieved a small package from under their pine branch tree and brought it to Jonathan with great ceremony. "This is for you. We made it together." Inside was a photo album, the kind with clear plastic sleeves, filled with pictures. Not professional photographs, but printed images from Maria's phone, moments captured over the past 3 years at Ashford Manor. Sophie as a baby in her mother's arms in the garden. Sophie taking her first steps on the manor's lawn. Sophie feeding the ducks at the estate's pond. Sophie at every age, in every season, a chronicle of a childhood unfolding in the margins of his life, while he'd been too isolated to notice. And scattered throughout were pictures that must have been taken by the manor's security cameras or by other staff members. Images of Jonathan himself, caught in unguarded moments. Standing by a window, his reflection showing a man who looked lost. Walking the grounds alone. Sitting in his study late at night, the only light coming from his computer screen. Each image was a portrait of loneliness, so stark that Jonathan almost couldn't bear to look at them. The final page held Sophie's crayon drawing from the letter, carefully preserved in the plastic sleeve, with new words written in Maria's script below it. Everyone deserves to be part of a family. Everyone deserves to be loved. Everyone deserves to come home. Merry Christmas, Jonathan. With love, Maria and Sophie. Jonathan's hands shook as he held the album. He tried to speak and couldn't, the words tangling with tears in his throat. Years of suppressed emotion finally breaking through the careful control he'd maintained for so long. He set the album down carefully before he dropped it, and then he did something he hadn't done in 15 years. He let himself fall apart in front of other people, let himself be vulnerable and broken and human. Maria moved closer, and then her arms were around him, holding him while he wept. Sophie, with the emotional intelligence of children who've seen their parents cry, wrapped herself around his legs, murmuring, "It's okay, Uncle. Crying is good. Crying means your heart is fixing itself." When the storm finally passed, Jonathan found himself sitting on their small couch, Sophie on one side and Maria on the other, and feeling more held, more seen, more known than he had in longer than he could remember. "I want to do this right," he said finally, his voice rough but steady. I need to tell you both something important." They waited, Sophie with her head resting against his arm, Maria with her eyes full of something that looked like hope struggling against wisdom. "I've been alone for a very long time," Jonathan continued. "I convinced myself it was what I wanted, that isolation was safety, that not caring meant not hurting. But you too," his voice caught, and he had to stop and breathe. "Sophie, your letter showed me what I'd been missing. Maria, your kindness showed me what I'd forgotten people could be like. And last night, sitting in your home, eating your food, being part of your Christmas, it was the first time in 15 years that I felt like I was somewhere I belonged." "You do belong here," Sophie said matter-of-factly. "I told you we're family." Jonathan looked at Maria, needing to see her face, to understand if this feeling was shared or if he was projecting his own desperate loneliness onto a situation that she tolerated out of kindness or obligation. But what he saw in her eyes was neither pity nor duty. It was recognition. She was lonely too, he realized. Not in the same way he'd been lonely. She had Sophie, had purpose, had love. But she'd been alone in her own way, carrying burdens without anyone to share them, building a life without a partner to build it with, finding joy in motherhood while grieving the loss of the man who should have been there to witness their daughter's growth. "I'm afraid," Maria said quietly. "You live in a different world than we do. Your life is complicated and important, and we're just—" "You're not just anything," Jonathan interrupted. "You're everything. Don't you see that? All of this." He gestured at the mansion beyond the cottage walls, at the empire and the success and the accumulation of wealth and power that had defined his adult life. All of it is empty. It's impressive and it's valuable and it means absolutely nothing compared to what you have here. Love, connection, purpose, the things that actually matter. "But we're so different," Maria started. "Are we?" Jonathan asked. "We're both people who lost someone we loved. We're both people who've been scared to risk again. We're both people who put up walls to protect ourselves and then got trapped behind them. Maybe the circumstances look different, but I think we understand each other better than you're allowing yourself to believe. Maria was quiet for a long moment, her hand absently stroking Sophie's hair, while the little girl fought to keep her eyes open despite the early morning and the excitement. "What are you asking for, Jonathan?" "I don't know exactly," he admitted. "I don't have a plan or a strategy. I just know that I don't want to go back to the way things were. I don't want to wake up alone in that house, going through the motions of a life that isn't actually being lived. I want—" He struggled to find words adequate to the longing he was only beginning to understand. "I want to be part of this. Of your lives. I want Sophie to keep calling me uncle, and I want to have dinner in this cottage more often than in that dining room, and I want to learn how to be the person your daughter already believes I am." "And what person is that?" Maria asked softly.
"Family," Jonathan said. "She sees me as family. And I want to earn that. I want to be worthy of it.
I want—" He looked at Maria, at this woman who'd shown him more grace and kindness in a few weeks than he'd received in years. This woman who'd raised a child capable of seeing through his walls to the lonely man behind them. "I want a chance. Not to change your life or disrupt what you've built.
Just to be part of it.
To help if you'll let me. To learn from you. To figure out how to be human again, instead of just successful." Maria studied his face for a long moment, and Jonathan felt the weight of everything hanging in the balance. The possibility of connection or the safety of distance. The risk of hope or the certainty of emptiness. "Okay," she finally said. "Okay. We can try." The relief that flooded through Jonathan was so intense it was almost painful. "Really?" "Really," Maria confirmed. "But slowly. This isn't a business deal where you negotiate terms and sign contracts. This is people, Jonathan. This is a little girl who's already attached to you, who'll be hurt if you decide this isn't what you want after all. This is me, trying to protect her and myself while also hoping she stopped her own vulnerability showing through. While also hoping that maybe you're right. That maybe we understand each other. That maybe family really can be found in unexpected places." "I won't hurt her," Jonathan promised. "Or you. I know I don't have a great track record with relationships or commitment, but this is different. You're different. She's—" He looked down at Sophie, now fully asleep against his side, her little hand curled around his. "She's the first person in 15 years who made me want to be better. Who made me remember why being better matters." They sat in silence for a while, Sophie sleeping peacefully between them, the Christmas morning light filtering through the cottage windows. Jonathan thought about his mansion. 32 rooms of magnificent emptiness, and about this cottage. 2 rooms full of life and love. He thought about the choice he'd made without realizing he was making it, the path he'd started walking the moment he'd read a 3-year-old's letter and felt his carefully constructed walls begin to crumble. "What happens now?" Maria asked eventually. "I don't know," Jonathan admitted. "I'd like to spend today here if that's all right. Maybe help Sophie try out some of her new art supplies. Have leftovers for lunch.
Just be here.
And then tomorrow, maybe we could take Sophie to see the Christmas lights in town? And next week, I thought, if you're comfortable with it, maybe Sophie could come up to the house for dinner sometimes? I have a room that could be turned into an art studio, with better light than she is here," and he stopped himself, recognizing the impulse to try to plan and organize and control.
"Sorry.
I'm doing the business thing again. Making proposals and strategies." Maria smiled, and it transformed her whole face, erasing years of worry and fatigue. "It's okay. I know who you are, Jonathan. I'm not asking you to completely change. Just to learn to be flexible. To let things unfold naturally instead of trying to manage them." "I can try," Jonathan said. "I'm not sure I'll be good at it." "None of us are good at it," Maria replied. "That's what makes it real." The day did unfold naturally. without agenda or schedule. They made breakfast together in the tiny kitchen, Jonathan awkwardly navigating the unfamiliar space while Maria patiently showed him where things were kept and how the temperamental stove worked. Sophie woke up and immediately wanted to use her new art supplies, spreading paper and crayons across every surface while explaining her artistic vision with the seriousness of a master painter discussing their technique. Jonathan found himself drawn into her world, following instructions to draw trees, but make them friendly trees, not scary ones, and help mix colors. Red and blue make purple, but you have to use more blue than red or it's just angry purple instead of nice purple. For a man who'd spent years making decisions that affected thousands of employees and millions of dollars, the most important question in his life became whether Sophie's drawing of their family in the summer should include a dog. "I've always wanted a dog," Sophie confided, leaning against his shoulder to study their collaborative artwork. "But Mama says our cottage is too small and also dogs are pending, which means not yet, but maybe someday." "Expensive," Maria corrected from where she was cleaning up the breakfast dishes. "I said dogs are expensive, Mija." "That too," Sophie agreed cheerfully. "But Uncle is really rich, right, Mama? You said he's a billionaire, which is even more rich than regular rich. So maybe he could help us be pending a dog." The casual way she included him in her us made Jonathan's throat tight. "Would you like a dog?" he asked Maria, seeing an opportunity to be helpful without overstepping. Maria turned to look at them, her expression complicated. Jonathan could see her weighing how to respond, the automatic impulse to refuse help warring with the reality of her daughter's wish and her own exhaustion from carrying everything alone. "Sophie would love a dog," Maria said carefully. "But this is exactly what I meant about going slowly. You can't just, Jonathan, you can't solve everything with money. That's not what this is about." "I know," Jonathan said quickly. "I'm sorry. You're right. I'm not used to being around people I care about without being able to fix things or help or," he stopped, hearing his own words. "People I care about." I said that out loud. "You did," Maria confirmed, and her smile was soft and knowing and kind. "Well, it's true," Jonathan said, deciding that if he was going to do this thing of being human and vulnerable and connected, he might as well commit to it. "I care about you both. I know it's fast, and I know I don't have a right to feel this way yet, but I do. And I'm going to keep caring about you, whether you let me get a dog or not." Sophie giggled. "Uncle, you're silly. You don't get a dog for yourself. You get a dog for us to share. That's how families work. Everything is for sharing." And there it was again, that word that had become the axis around which Jonathan's world was reorienting. Family. Not the one he'd lost, not the one he'd given up on ever having again, but a new configuration that didn't fit any conventional definition, but felt more real than anything had in years. They spent the afternoon walking through the estate grounds, Sophie running ahead to examine every interesting rock and leaf while Jonathan and Maria followed at a slower pace. The silence between them was comfortable now, less charged with uncertainty than with possibility. "Thank you," Jonathan said eventually, "for giving me a chance, for not dismissing me as just some lonely rich man trying to buy his way into your life." "Are you?" Maria asked. "Trying to buy your way in?" "No," Jonathan said. "At least, I don't think so. I honestly don't know how to do this, Maria. I know how to acquire companies and manage portfolios and negotiate deals. I have no idea how to be part of a family, how to be someone's." He struggled for the right word, for the term that would describe what he hoped to become in their lives. "Friend," Maria suggested gently. "Start there. Be our friend, Jonathan. The rest can figure itself out." "Friends," Jonathan repeated, trying out the word. When was the last time he'd had a real friend, someone who knew him beyond his net worth or his reputation? "I can do friends,"
I think. Probably.
Maybe you'll have to teach me. Maria laughed, the sound bright and genuine. I think Sophie is already teaching you. She's certainly appointed herself your guide to being human again. They watched Sophie attempt to climb a small tree, her determination far exceeding her ability, her cheerful, "I can do it," ringing across the grounds even as she slid back down for the third time. "She reminds me of what I used to be like," Jonathan said. "Before I learned to be afraid. Before I decided that ambition was safer than affection. She just believes the world is good. Believes people will catch her if she falls. How do you preserve that in a child when the world is often not good and people often don't catch you?" "You love her enough that she knows she's worth catching," Maria said simply. "You teach her to be kind and brave and to help others. You model what it looks like to get back up after you fall. And you," she paused, her eyes on her daughter, "you hope like hell that the world treats her better than it's treated you. That's all any parent can do." "You're an extraordinary parent," Jonathan said. "I hope you know that. The way you've raised her, the person she's becoming, that's all you, Maria. That's your love and your work and your sacrifice. It's remarkable." Maria's eyes glistened. "Thank you. That means more than you know. I spend a lot of time wondering if I'm doing enough, if she'll be okay, if I'm giving her what she needs despite." She gestured vaguely at the cottage, at their circumstances. "You're giving her everything that matters," Jonathan said firmly. "Everything I had and never appreciated. Everything I lost and spent 15 years grieving. She has you, and she has your love, and that's worth more than all of this." He gestured at the mansion, at the vast estate, at the material wealth that had filled none of the hollowness inside him. They stood together watching Sophie play, and Jonathan felt something shift in his chest, some final wall crumbling away. This was what he wanted. Not the next acquisition, or the next achievement, or the next number increasing in his accounts. This, standing in the cold watching a child play, talking with a woman who saw him clearly and chose to give him a chance anyway, being part of something small and real and precious. That evening, as the sun set and painted the snow golden pink, Jonathan reluctantly prepared to return to the mansion. Sophie hugged him goodbye with her usual exuberance, making him promise to come back soon. "Tomorrow?" she asked hopefully. "If your mother says it's okay," Jonathan replied, looking to Maria. "Tomorrow," Maria confirmed. "For the Christmas lights, like you suggested. We can make a day of it." As Jonathan walked back to the mansion, the scarf Maria had made wrapped around his neck, Sophie's drawing folded carefully in his pocket, he felt something he hadn't experienced in so long he'd almost forgotten to recognize it. Hope. Not the abstract hope for a successful quarter or a profitable merger, but real hope, personal hope, the kind that came with risk and vulnerability and the terrifying possibility that he might have found, in the most unexpected place, a reason to try being human again. The mansion was dark when he entered, but it didn't feel quite as empty as it had before. Tomorrow, he would have dinner with Maria and Sophie again. Next week, maybe Sophie would use his library for her art projects. Over time, perhaps the boundaries between his world and theirs would blur until the distinctions stopped mattering entirely. He thought about Sophie's drawing, about the purple stick figure sitting at a table surrounded by people who loved him. It had seemed like fantasy when he first saw it, a child's naive reimagining of reality. But now, as he stood in his mansion that was slowly becoming less of a prison and more of a possibility, Jonathan wondered if maybe Sophie hadn't been drawing fantasy at all. Maybe she'd been drawing prophecy. Maybe she'd seen what he was too afraid to imagine, that family could be found, that home could be built, that even the loneliest person could learn to belong if they were brave enough to accept love when it was offered. Jonathan Ashford, billionaire and tech genius, man who had spent 2 decades building walls and empires, stood alone in his mansion and smiled. Because tomorrow he would see them again. And the day after that. And all the days stretching forward into a future that, for the first time in 15 years, he actually wanted to live. He climbed the stairs to his bedroom, past the photographs he'd uncovered in the East Wing, past the rooms that would slowly fill with life if he was brave enough to let it happen. And before he slept, he took out his phone and sent a simple text to Maria. "Thank you for the best Christmas I've had in 15 years. See you tomorrow. Jay." Her response came quickly. "Thank you for seeing us. For really seeing us. Sleep well, Jonathan. We'll be here tomorrow. We'll be here tomorrow." Such simple words. Such an enormous promise. The promise that he wouldn't be alone. That there were people now who expected him, who would miss him if he didn't show up, who had made space in their lives for his presence. Jonathan fell asleep holding his phone, Maria's words glowing on the screen, Sophie's drawing on his nightstand, the scarf around his neck even though he was inside, safe and warm. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, his dreams were not of the family he'd lost, but of the family he was learning to be part of, the unexpected gift of a lonely child's generous heart and a woman brave enough to let him try. The mansion was still large and still luxurious, still filled with everything money could buy. But it was no longer empty. Because Jonathan Ashford had learned what his staff and his business associates and his distant relatives had never taught him, what only a 3-year-old girl named Sophie and her remarkable mother could show him. That home wasn't a place you owned, but a feeling you earned. And that family, real family, was sometimes found not where you expected it, but exactly where you needed it, in a cottage behind a mansion, in a letter written in crayon, in a simple invitation to belong.